So today we'll do 6.5. Tomorrow 6.6. 6.7 on Wednesday. 6.8 will be a video for Thursday. You made it. So cool. All right. Excuse me. Ate too many gummy bears or something. All right. If you would, open your books to page 32. Let's start sawing through this. I gotta take attendance. All right. So this first statement kind of says quite a bit. It says the lower the p-value, the stronger the statistical evidence against the null. Lower p-value, stronger evidence against the null. Okay. Oh, that one didn't show up yet. We're on page 32. All right. Lower the p-value, stronger the evidence against the null. So we had been saying that we wanted our p-value to be less than 0.05 when we do our test, right? And 0.05 basically means that you would be 95% confident that things would be in a certain way. If your p-value is less than 0.05, that means that you're talking about less than 0.05, depending upon if it's a one or two tail. If it's a one tail, you have 5% to the left or 5% to the right. If it's a two tail, you have 2.5 on either end, because 2.5 plus 2.5 is 5. Okay, so, when does this p-value become low enough that we decide to reject the null hypothesis? So when can we be sure p is low enough to reject the null? Okay, so that's kind of the big question. So we started the basic rule of thumb. We said p-values below 0.05 will allow us to reject the null hypothesis. The rule of thumb is common in both medicine and in psychology, but it should not be a default choice. In truth, the researcher selects the level at which we reject the null. Okay, it's kind of interesting. The researcher is the person who figures out that p-value to reject the null. So the basic understanding is, if I had the 0.05 as my p-value, that means I had 95%, and I had already said this. So 95%, if it was a one tail, you would have 5% here or 5% here. So that would be for a one tail situation. If you had a two tail situation, my normal curve's getting incredible. Okay, so this is basically the difference between the two. Okay, 32. All right, so the researcher selects the level at which we reject the null. Is 5% wiggle room enough for you to say, hey, we found a selection of data that happen to fall outside of that? Should it be lower? Could it be higher? I guess what you really have to fathom here is you have to know who your audience would be in this situation. If you're talking about the general public, you could make up p-values and just present it to the general public, and they'd follow along with it saying, yeah, you're right. Okay? But think about if you had a certain medication. And I know we keep going back to medication, but it's just one of those things. But let's say you have a medication that the side effects of the medication are the most horrific side effects you could ever encounter. But that new drug will cure a body of cancer. You have to weigh those side effects in, because some of those side effects you listen to on those commercials, if you ever have listened to some of them, I've heard some of them, the side effects are death. You know, like, I got to be really certain that whatever ailment I possibly have with my body, if I'm going to ingest a medication that a side effect could be death, I'm not quite sure if I feel 100% comfortable with that. So it's kind of, kind of the unique thing. There was a, do you remember the whole fad that went on a few years ago on they were called quote unquote fat-free chips, and they had an oil they used called Olean. This oil Olean, they had to put a disclaimer on these bags, because if you ingested Olean, you could mess your pants, like poop yourself. So it's like, I'm going to eat these fat-free chips. Well, you could poop your pants if you eat them. That's got to be one hell of a chip for me to eat, that I got to roll the dice that I might lose my bowels. So it kind of cracks me up. But I remember seeing that disclaimer on the bag going, okay, every other bag of chips here has nothing like this, but it's like, if you eat these chips, you might poop your pants. I don't think they're out on the market right now, because let's face it, nobody wants to do that. Okay, so what we're saying on page 32, it says, the researcher selects the level, we reject the null. The level is called alpha. And you'll start seeing the Greek letter alpha look like this. Okay? Is represented by that symbol. Alpha must be set by the researcher ahead of time to do hindsight after the sample has been chosen and data has been collected. It is considered unethical because it allows the researcher to manipulate the conclusion of the study. Reasonable values of alpha could be 0.01, it could be 0.05, could even be 0.10. Okay? But there's no absolute thing. That's the real scary thing about what we had stated here. It is very possible somebody does a study and they realize, if I change my alpha value after the fact, or they don't even present an alpha value, they do their study, and then they want to reject the null because that shows their product out there works. I mean, statistics could be really perverted in a way that I don't think that some of you realize yet, but it's just one of those things where it's like, do you trust the person who did the statistics on it? And I guess it comes down to, if you had some sort of situation that you're putting out there, there's going to be an awful lot of testing towards it that we have to look to. Alpha can be loosely thought of as the complement of confidence. So if we select an alpha value of 0.05, we're associating that with being 95% confident. We reject the null hypothesis. If we select an alpha value of 0.02, we're associating that with being 98% confident when we reject the null hypothesis. Lower values of alpha make it harder to reject the null. We need stronger evidence to generate lower p-value. However, if we do reject the null, we do so with more confidence and less of a chance of making a type 1 error. Okay? So remember, a type 1 error reject the null when it's really true. All right, so a real loose situation on here. Are there people who are in jail or in prison right now that actually didn't commit the crime? It's a real thing, yes? Okay, so a real loose way of saying a type 1 error is we reject the null when it's really true. So our null hypothesis is the person did not commit the crime. That's our null. Our alternative, the person did commit the crime. So a type 1 error in that situation is we reject the null. So we said, hey, the person did the crime. But the null was actually true. They didn't. Okay? And I think it's absolutely a horrific thing if somebody is incarcerated for something they didn't do. I mean, there's got to be a better system. And I was reading that stuff the other day. Who's that lawyer in North Carolina?
Oh, Murdoch?
Murdoch, yeah. I was reading an article, it was in yesterday's paper, that was talking about how they convicted him, but how they were questioning the ethical behavior of it. Like, well, we showed that he was driving 80 miles an hour right before the crime. Okay, driving 80 miles an hour does not necessarily mean you're going to commit a crime. I mean, you're already committing a crime if you're like in a 40 mile an hour zone doing 80, but there's just some stuff that they're saying. Then they were talking about where the cell phone, they were looking at the cell phone records of data and using everything about the cell phone to prove reducers. Like, look, his cell phone shows he was on the property. Well, he lives there. Yeah, but he was on the property, right as the crimes were taking place. I mean, I'm not trying to say he was a good person or bad person or anything in between, but I was just reading some of the things that they were using as evidence against him saying he is not guilty. And again, I don't know the truth. I'm not part of the thing, and of course, reading the newspaper tries to cite it one way or the other. Okay, so lower values of alpha make it harder to reject the null. We need stronger evidence to generate a lower p-value. However, if we do reject it, obviously type 1. In fact, alpha is the probability we make a type 1 error. So this alpha value is the probability that we make a type 1 error. Higher values of alpha make it easier to reject the null and find stronger evidence we are looking for. However, if we do so with less confidence, imagine selecting an alpha value of 90%. It would be very easy to reject the null, but we do so with only 10% confidence. In fact, this makes no sense. We would finding strong evidence for something that admittedly there's 90% chance of getting wrong. I mean, that's crazy. I have a question. Does anybody have, in that very second to the last paragraph, it ends with alpha, and then I have my first line says making a type 1 or type 2 error. Does anybody have any print there? If you look on the bottom of page 32, the last 3 lines do you have a fourth line above it on the very bottom of it? No? Okay. Yeah, I guess something didn't print. I can see that there's something that should have been there, but for whatever reason. So if we think a type 1 error would be a huge risk, we would set the alpha low. If we think a type 2 error would be a huge risk, we would set the alpha very high. Okay? Selecting the alpha value is controversial. It's better to allow the reader to evaluate the p-value on their own rather than set an arbitrary cutoff value and decide one way or the other. This is understandable. If a p-value is 0.87 or 0.087, and you fail to reject the null, it means that there is some good evidence against the null hypothesis, but not quite enough to meet the criteria for rejecting the null hypothesis. Too often, researchers fail to reject the null, think their study is not of value, but clearly the results warrant more attention than that. There was, after all, some evidence against the null. The following chart, so this is an interesting chart. So again, we're talking about the alpha value. The alpha value becomes the p-value, is what the p-value was. So they're saying this is true, this is false, accept, reject. Notice it's all based on the null. So just have kind of this box here. So if H naught is true and we accept the null, this is the correct decision. If our null is false, but we accept the null, this is a type 2 error. If our null is true and we reject the null, this is a type 1 error. Okay? So this is what they're saying is the alpha error. And then if the null is false and we reject the null, this is the correct decision. So looking just at this grid, we have two things that fall in the grid that are the correct decision and two that fall into the incorrect. So then it becomes a 50-50 shot because there's 4 decisions. Now, it becomes 50-50 when our alpha value is 0.5, not 0.05, but 0.5. As we change that, make that alpha value, our p-value that we're now calling alpha, we make that a lower and lower and lower amount, you get a less and less chance of a type 1 error taking place. Okay? And then a side note, the Greek symbol beta, so this is they call this a beta error, is the probability of making a type 2 error. Okay, we are not going to do the math behind the type 2 errors in. A type 2 error is a lot less chance of it happening. So the probability of making a type 1 and type 2 error are inversely related. The chance of making a type 1 error is lower. The chance of a type 2 would be raised and vice versa. Okay, so there's some strange errors that could take place. And again, think back in this kind of situation. You have somebody who is on trial. They are innocent. They did not commit the crime that they're being charged with. But they find this person guilty because the evidence that they're trying to point towards this person shows, and what's the term they use in the courtroom? If you can prove within a reasonable doubt. Okay, so the courtrooms, they're using terminology that is pretty much the same as what we're hearing here in statistics. It's like, man, we're wavering from stuff. All right, so my friends, this is the week before spring break. I understand that. Okay, but I'd like you to work on page 101 and 102. We'll definitely go over it. So just so you know, again, I told some of you guys who are here early. So so today is 6.5. We'll go over 6.5 today. Go to Tuesday 6.6, Wednesday 6.7, and then Thursday. Thursday we will do the 6.4 to 6.7 review. Okay. So what that means is I will have a video for the 6.4 to 6.7 review done for you because I will not be here on Thursday. I'm going to take a day off. Is that okay? The reason is my daughters are in town. They want to go ski with dad. I thought that was okay. And y'all know I don't really miss all that often. That's my first day I'll take off this whole year. Although there are some teachers that they use up their sick days every year. I'm like, why are you even here? I don't know. So